What is your vision of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
I think that the best way to achieve peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis is with a two-state solution. And this would, of course, involve the Palestinians getting a viable state of their own. However, I think there's virtually no chance that that's going to happen, in large part because the Israelis are opposed to giving the Palestinians a viable state. So I think what we're going to end up with is a greater Israel that is effectively an apartheid state for the foreseeable future. I think, however, that's not sustainable over the long term.
So why would you be in favor of two-state solution when you know it's not going to happen?
Well, I'm in favor of it, and I've been in favor of it for a long time. But the fact is, it's now reached the point where it's just no longer a possible outcome. But I still favor it, even though it's not going to happen.
Uh-huh. So isn't that like a really futile to be in favor of something that is not going to happen?
Yes, and that's why I said that what we're going to get is a one-state solution.
Uh-huh. Do you see the Israeli public and the Palestinian public, for that matter, the whole world and the United States? I'll focus on the United States right now. Is the public in the United States demanding peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
No, I don't think the American public cares that much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Uh-huh.
The fact is the United States is a remarkably secure country. It has hardly any threats that are significant enough to motivate the American people to pay attention to foreign policy. So the United States just doesn't care very much about what happens with regard to Israel-Palestine in the body politic at large.
Uh-huh. And in your opinion, the public in Israel and the Palestinian public, are they demanding peace, in your opinion? Are they demanding peace of their leaders?
Well, I don't think in the Israeli case that the public is demanding peace. I think the public is very interested in living in a world where there are no suicide bombers or terrorist attacks. But other than that, I think the Israeli public, by and large, is perfectly content with the status quo. I don't think they're demanding that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict be resolved once and for all.
Mm.
With regard to the Palestinians, I think the vast majority of Palestinians would love to see a fair resolution of the problem. They'd be crazy not to be. They live under terrible conditions, and the status quo is almost unbearable. So anything that promised a better future, and certainly peace would fit in that category, would be desirable to most of the Palestinians, I'm sure.
Yeah, but there's a difference between desirable and demanding peace. Do you think the Palestinian people are demanding peace of their leaders?
No.
So really, neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian public is pushing their leaders to come up with a peaceful solution.
No, I think that's correct.
I see. Now, we've been talking, or the public or the leaders have been talking about a two-state, and some are talking about a one-state. But there could be other formulas for peace. Why are other formulas being ignored?
Undoubtedly because most people think that those other formulas are not workable. I think what's happened with the two-state solution is that more and more people are abandoning talk of a two-state solution because they think it's no longer feasible, and that a one-state solution is really the only outcome. I think that policymakers, for sure, and elites who study these issues tend to focus on solutions that are viable, not those that are not viable. And this gets back to your first question to me.
Yeah, but if they focus on solutions that are viable, and one of them is the two-state solution, which, I mean, all the leaders of the world, you see president after president and Secretary of State after Secretary of State, saying the two-state solution is the only solution. And time and time again it failed. So why is it that we are not focusing on other solutions rather than coming up with something that is really by default is created, which is a one-state?
Well, I think there are two reasons that people tend to focus on the two-state solution even now. And that is that up until very recently, it appeared that a two-state solution was a viable alternative. And because most people think it is preferable to a one-state solution, there was a lot of interest across the world in pushing a two-state solution. Of course, now I think most people recognize that's not a likely outcome. Second point I would make to you is that the alternative to a two-state solution is a one-state solution, and that one state, which is a greater Israel, is an apartheid state. And I think that most people don't want to face up to that brutal fact, and therefore they're in a state of denial. And they therefore continue to talk about a two-state solution, even though it's no longer feasible.
So the discussions of two states that is theoretically still going on right now, is that really a game of chicken between the Israelis and the Palestinians, basically pretending that they're going through some sort of negotiations?
Well, I think in the case of the Palestinians, I think that the individuals, Mahmoud Abbas and company, who have been engaged in these negotiations with the Israelis, do believe that it is a possible outcome. I don't understand why they think that. It should be clear to them by now that a two-state solution is not a viable outcome. But it does seem clear that they think that the United States can put enough pressure on Israel, that Israel will accede to a two-state solution. So I think that's what's going on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, I think the Israelis are perfectly content to continue talking about a two-state solution and to continue the peace process, which is aimed at achieving a two-state outcome, because it's perfect cover for continuing colonization of the West Bank.
There is the BDS movement. Do you support BDS in terms of Israel, Palestine, or the West Bank only? Or what's your position on that?
Well, I would be fully in favor of the United States government putting really tough sanctions on Israel for the purposes of forcing Israel to accept a two-state solution. Now, some people might say that this is anti-Israel. I don't believe it's anti-Israel. I think it would be good for Israel. I think that the path that Israel is headed down is a disastrous one. I think that turning Israel into an apartheid state makes no strategic or moral sense for Israel itself. So if we could put sanctions on Israel and really force them to accept a two-state solution, it would be for the good of the Israelis. And of course, I think it would be for the good of the Palestinians as well.
But the two-state solution, isn't that really a divorce plan between the Israelis and the Palestinians? It's not as far as I can see, it's not a plan for peace. It's a plan for separation, for divorce.
It's a plan for separation. And the fact of the matter is that Zionism is an ideology that privileges Jews over all others. Zionism is all about creating a Jewish state. It's a state in which Jews are first-class citizens and other people are either second-class or third-class citizens. So if you're going to have a Jewish state, if you're going to have Zionism, there's no way you can have Palestinians living in the midst of that state and have them treated as equal citizens. So the reason that we're moving to a two-state solution, or let me put it differently, the reason that we're talking about a two-state solution, we're not moving towards it, is because people are interested in giving the Palestinians a state where they have full rights.
So the reason for a two-state solution is to separate the Palestinians from the Israelis so that they will not be second-class citizens.
Correct.
Okay. But isn't that really supporting the idea that Zionist Jews are superior and they need to be separated from Palestinians because they are superior?
I'd put it in different terms. I'd say it's a recognition of the fact that nationalism is a remarkably powerful ideology. Zionism is Jewish nationalism, and the fact is that Jews, like Germans, like Japanese, want a state of their own, and they have a state called Israel, and they want to keep that state. And I think it makes good sense at this point in time to facilitate the maintenance of a Jewish state. At the same time, I think it's imperative that the Palestinians have a state of their own. The idea of the Palestinians living in a Jewish state where they're treated as second or third class citizens is, in my opinion, deeply problematic, to put it mildly. So what we want to do is create a Palestinian state in the same way that a Jewish state was once created.
My understanding on Zionism and the reason for Zionism is that Jews wanted to be safe from persecutions. That's the reason for the creation of a Jewish state. It's not really, the purpose is not to create a superior group of people.
Well, I think it's partly right to say that the reason for creating Zionism and eventually Israel was to create a safe haven for Jews. That's partly correct. But I think there's another very important dimension to this, and that is that the early Zionists lived in Europe. Before they went to Palestine, they lived in Europe. In large part, they lived in the Palace settlement. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, nationalism was sweeping across Europe like a giant tidal wave. And nationalism affected all of the different minority groups on the continent. And large numbers of minority groups wanted a state of their own. And it is therefore hardly surprising, given what was in the ether at the time, that the Jews began to think about creating a Jewish state, that they invented Zionism as a concept.
But do you think that the two state, let's assume that it's going to happen, the two state, which I understand you don't think it's going to happen, but let's assume it does happen.
Okay.
Would that give peace to Israel? Would that give peace to the Palestinians?
I think there's a very good chance that it would. I think if you created a viable Palestinian state, where the Palestinians had a vibrant economy, and people were allowed to lead a decent life, and they had almost complete self-determination, I think they would be satisfied, and they would not be interested in attacking Israel. They would be interested in living in peace with Israel so that they could maintain what they have. And I think the Israelis in that situation would have no incentive to try to conquer or reconquer Palestinian territory and start the conflict all over again.
My Palestinian friend tell me, they said, look, let's assume you were thrown out of your house and you were asked to negotiate now to live in half of the backyard. Would you agree to that? And my response is obviously not. I would want to go back to my house. So they said, well, we want to go back to our house too. So the idea is that the two state is that the Palestinians would be satisfied in living in the backyard. Does that make sense?
Well, we have to be realistic about this. There's no way that the Palestinians who were expelled in 1948 are going to be able to go back and reclaim their homes. It's just not feasible for the foreseeable future. So the question is, what's the second best alternative? And in my opinion, the second best alternative is to give them, the Palestinians that is, a state of their own in the entirety of the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and do everything possible to make that a viable state. Is this an ideal solution? No. Is this a fair solution in light of what happened in 1948? No. But is it the best solution? I think the answer is yes. And I think the real tragedy here is that we're not going to get a two-state solution. We're instead going to get a greater Israel that is an apartheid state.
We were talking about Zionism before, and I want to compare Martin Luther King to Herzl. Martin Luther King said to his people, we need to stay in America and we need to fight for our rights. Herzl, on the other hand, said, we have no place in Europe, we need to have a state of our own. Who do you think had the better approach, Martin Luther King or Herzl?
I don't think the question is properly framed. It assumes that there's a clear choice between the two, and one is right and one is wrong. And they're both right, it's just that they're very different circumstances. Martin Luther King was operating in a liberal state, and it was a state where supposedly everyone living within the borders of that state living within the borders of the United States supposed to have equal rights. And what Martin Luther King was demanding was that the black citizens in America be given equal rights. And because we are, here in the United States, a liberal state, he eventually triumphed.
Mm-hmm.
The situation that the Jews faced in Europe was fundamentally different. Most of them lived in the Palace Settlement. There were no liberal states there. And there was no way that the Jews who lived in places like Poland and Russia were going to get equal rights in a liberal state, because that was just not a serious possibility. So what the Jews in the Palace Settlement wanted, or at least a proportion of them did, was to create a state of their own. It's the same way that Slovaks and Czechs and Hungarians and Poles wanted states of their own. So it was a story that was all about nationalism in Eastern Europe. This was the milieu that Herzl and the Jews were in. Whereas in the case of Martin Luther King, it had nothing to do with nationalism. It had everything to do with liberalism, which is a fundamentally different ideology than nationalism. And when you're talking about liberalism, you're talking about rights. And Martin Luther King was demanding not a black state, right, or a state for African Americans.
Right.
He was demanding equal rights, which
Right.
is really all about liberalism.
So why couldn't the Jews in Europe demand equal rights before the 1900s?
Well, in large part because there were remarkably few liberal states on the continent, and hardly any of them were in Eastern Europe, which is where the Jews were. So it just didn't make any sense to think seriously about equal rights. It made much more sense to think about nationalism. It made much more sense to think about Zionism, in large part because that was in the ether in Eastern Europe at the time. And I would note to you, by the way, that if you look at what happened to most of the Jews in the Pale of Settlement who left in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they did not go to Palestine. Zionism actually held little attraction for most Jews.
Correct.
Most of those Jews who left the Pale of Settlement came to the United States.
Right.
Hardly any of them have left the United States to go to Israel. And the vast majority of Jews who came to the United States have flourished here and love liberal America. They love living in a liberal society. So it's not that Jews don't like a liberal country where they have equal rights. Indeed, they do. What they don't like is living in a place like Eastern Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where there are no liberal societies and they're harshly discriminated against. In that kind of world, it's not surprising that Zionism is going to be a reasonably powerful force. But again, it was not too powerful a force because very few Jews who lived in the Pale of Settlement opted for the Zionist alternative.
But wasn't Germany and Austria liberal states before Hitler?
Well, first of all, there were remarkably few Jews as a percentage of the overall total in Europe, in Germany and in Austria. The vast majority of Jews were in the Pale of Settlement, which is in Poland and
Russia.
Austria was not a liberal state, and some people might argue that Weimar Germany was a liberal state, but it was a state that was quite tumultuous. I'd also note, just with regard to the Jews who lived in Germany, even though Hitler came to power on January 30th, 1933, the overwhelming majority of German Jews did not leave until 1938. It was Kristallnacht in November 1938 that caused a huge exodus of Jews, because most Jews loved living in Germany. Most German Jews loved living in Germany and were not anxious to leave, and thought that Hitler's anti-Semitism would be a passing phenomenon. Of course, after Kristallnacht, it was clear that that was not the case, and huge numbers of Jews began to race for the exits for all the obvious reasons.
So, talking now about the one-state solution that it looks like it may happen now, would that require the dismantling of the Israeli government, the Palestinian governments, Hamas government? Or what kind of scenario are we going to see in that one state?
Well, there are basically two possible outcomes. One is a greater Israel with apartheid, or a greater Israel that is a democratic state. And what you're going to get in the short and medium term, for sure, is an apartheid state. And what that means is maintenance of the status quo. There are many people who argue, I think quite convincingly, that you already have a greater Israel and it is an apartheid state. So it's just going to be the maintenance of the status quo for the foreseeable future. However, I think over the long term, that is not sustainable. I do not think that Israel will be able to maintain itself as an apartheid state over the long term, in the same way that white South Africa was not able to maintain itself. So I think eventually that apartheid state will become a democratic state. And because the Palestinians will outnumber the Jews in that greater Israel, that will be the death blow to Zionism, because it would be impossible to have a Jewish state in a world where there are more Palestinians than Jews, and the state is democratic.
So basically what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Zionist movement is basically destroying itself by insisting on having two states and by not being able to create two states.
I think that Israel and its staunchest supporters in the United States are basically committing suicide by pursuing a one-state solution. I think it's in Israel's interest to pursue two states. I think one state is the kiss of death for Zionism. And it boggles my mind that the Israelis and their hardline supporters in the United States don't understand that.
So why do you think they don't understand that? They're intelligent people.
Well, I think that they tend to think tactically, not strategically. They don't think about the long term, they think about the short term, and I think that they're convinced that in the short term, they will be able to rely on the Israel lobby in the United States and in Europe to protect them. I think they're fully aware of the fact that that Israel will come under harsh criticism for being an apartheid state, not only from Palestinians, but also from many Jewish intellectuals and just many average Jews. But nevertheless, that Israel will be able to withstand that criticism because the lobby is so powerful that it can protect them. And I want to be clear that they're correct in the short term and in the middle term, but I don't think they're correct in the long term. I think that an apartheid state is so reprehensible from the perspective of Western values that it's just not sustainable over the long term.
Right. Do you think Israel is a safety net for the Jews around the world?
As an American, it's very hard for me to buy that argument because I think Jews are perfectly safe here in the United States. I don't think we discriminate between Jews and non-Jews in any meaningful way. The intermarriage rate among American Jews who are not of a serious religious bent is about 62%.
Right.
That means that Jews and Goys are marrying each other all the time, and you have so much intermingling and you have so much toleration because this is a liberal society that I think, thoughts of a second Holocaust occurring here in the United States make no sense at all. I don't know anybody who seriously argues that that's a possibility. So it's hard for me to see why Israel is needed from the perspective of an American. Now, there are obviously concentrations of Jews in other states where terrible things could potentially happen to them. But it's hard to see today where that might be the case. And if it were to occur, there's no reason that the United States and other countries couldn't move in before anything happened to put tremendous pressure on the relevant government to allow those Jews to leave, to come to either the United States or go to Western Europe or what have you. But it's very hard for me to see where anti-Semitism is a serious problem, the way many of Israel's defenders argue. I would note, by the way, that the fastest growing Jewish community in the world is in Germany. Now, admittedly, Berlin. It's starting from a small base, but Germany is a very friendly place for Jews these days. And there are good numbers of Israelis who are leaving for Germany and for Europe more generally. And of course, Europe, especially the western half of the continent, is quite liberal, much like the United States.
So is the term Jewish democracy or Jewish state a democratic state? Is that an oxymoron? Can you have a Jewish democracy?
Well, you can have a Jewish democracy. You can have an Israel that is democratic and that maintains its Jewish identity, as long as you have more Jews than Palestinians or more Jews than non-Jews living in the borders of that state. And of course, that has been the case up till recently. But with the creation of a greater Israel, you've reached the point where there probably are now more Palestinians than Israeli Jews. And that means that if you had a fully democratic system in Israel, in greater Israel, if you afforded the Palestinians equal rights, it would no longer be a Jewish state.
Mm-hmm.
So democracy is not good for anyone who's interested in maintaining Israel as a Jewish state.
Right.
In this demographic situation.
So tell me, why do you think Kerry and would spend so much effort on creating two states between the Israelis and the Palestinians when this formula failed again and again and again? Is he naive, or why would he do that?
Well, I think he's clearly naive. It's just hard to believe that at this point in time, somebody in Kerry's position doesn't understand that the two-state solution is not going to work. I find it hard to believe that he doesn't understand that the only way you could have a two-state solution is if the United States put huge pressure on Israel to accept a viable Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. And he must understand, having spent all that time in Washington and served as a U.S. Senator, that no president can put any pressure on Israel of any consequence. The Israel lobby just wouldn't allow that to happen. So why he thought that he could push forward a two-state solution at this point in time is quite baffling.
You know, I read your very interesting article, and in it you said that this is your recent article, and in it you said Middle Eastern states that do not have much oil are of little strategic significance to the United States. They include Egypt and Syria, as well as Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Yemen. Thus, it makes little sense for Americans to worry much about what is happening in Egypt and Syria, much less encounter military intervention in those countries. But you didn't mention Israel in terms of, you said it makes little sense for Americans to worry much about what is happening in Egypt and Syria. But what about in Israel?
The same is true for Israel. Israel is strategically insignificant for the United States.
So what's the reason the United States is supporting Israel so much? Politically, economically,
well, I think that there is a powerful moral imperative for supporting Israel because of the Holocaust. I think that has always been a factor. I don't think it accounts in any way, shape, or form for the relationship we have with Israel. But I do think it matters. I think the main reason that we have this, what people call special relationship with Israel, a relationship that has no precedent in history, is because of the Israel lobby, which is enormously important and influential in Washington.
So is it the Israeli lobby, or is it the Holocaust, or is it both?
No, I think it's in part the Holocaust, but it's a small part of the story. Right? The argument I'm making is that there is no strategic rationale for the close relationship. And in fact, one could argue, if anything, that Israel is a strategic liability in the post-Cold War world. I think there is a moral imperative. I don't think the moral imperative is anywhere near strong enough to account for the present relationship that we have with Israel. I think what can account in large part for that relationship is the power of the Israel lobby.
So let's say there was no Israeli lobby. You think the United States would have been able to pressure Israel to accept the two-state solution?
If there was no Israel lobby, number one, we would have a fundamentally different relationship with Israel today, and we would have had a fundamentally different relationship with Israel since the mid-1960s. And number two, there would be a viable Palestinian state today because the United States would have put enormous pressure on Israel to accept a two-state solution. And it would have been able to do that with relative ease in the 70s and 80s.
So the Israeli lobby, in your view, is harming the state of Israel?
I believe the Israel lobby is disastrous for Israel. I believe it's never healthy for any two states to have a special relationship like the United States has with Israel. First of all, the United States and Israel don't have the same interests. No two states have the same interests. And the special relationship basically says that the United States has to support Israel hook, line, and sinker, no matter what Israel does. So we have this bizarre situation where if Israel is pursuing a policy that's not in America's interest, we have to support Israel anyway. That's not smart at all. But the second reason that this policy makes no sense is that Israel, like any other state in the system, occasionally pursues foolish policies. As we all know, the United States pursues foolish policies. But if Israel pursues a foolish policy, the United States can do nothing to stop Israel from pursuing that policy because we have to support Israeli policy no matter what. Mm-hmm. So Israel continues to build settlements, continues to colonize the West Bank and turn itself into an apartheid state, and we have to support it. Why? Because the special relationship says we support Israel no matter what it does. This is bizarre. It makes no sense at all. It's not good for Israel, and it's not good for the United States. But why do we do it? For one very simple reason, because of the power of the lobby. In the absence of that lobby, we would not pursue that special relationship, which would be good for us, and it would be good for Israel. So what we should do is we should treat Israel like a normal country. We should treat it the way we treat Britain, France, Germany, Japan, India.
What would have happened to, let's say, Barack Obama if he basically shunned the Israeli lobby and took policies that are fundamentally in support of the U.S. interest in the area?
He would have paid an awful political price. If you look at what he did in his first administration between 2009 and early 2012, right before the presidential election heated up, he put a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to move towards a two-state solution. Barack Obama was deeply committed to trying to make a two-state solution work in his first term. And he paid a serious political price for it. But by early 2012, knowing that the presidential election was coming up that November, he backed off. And he went to great lengths to make it clear that anything Israel wanted was fine with him. And he did this because he feared that the lobby would move against him in the campaign and he might get defeated.
Mm-hmm. There is no chance that there would be a backlash against the lobby if it goes against the president?
We've never seen any evidence of a backlash. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason to think that one is coming anytime soon.
I see. I'm just interested in your personal story. I mean, you wrote a very famous book. It's called The Israeli Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Could you tell me what happened to you after you wrote that book? What was your relationship with other people in the community?
Well, just to be clear, we first wrote an article called The Israel Lobby that appeared in the London Review of Books. This was in March 2006. And then we published the book in August of 2007. So by the time the book appeared, the argument was well known. And one could argue, I think, that the attacks that we came under after the article was published were greater than the attacks that we came under after the book was published, which is not to say that the attacks that were directed at us after the book weren't vicious and relentless. Anybody who criticizes Israel Anybody who criticizes the U.S.-Israeli relationship and anybody who criticizes the Israel lobby is going to pay a really awful price because the lobby is going to mobilize all of its considerable resources to come after you and damage you. It has a vested interest, I would argue, in ending your career if it can.
That was going to be my next question. I mean, did they try to end your career?
I think that that was the ultimate goal. I think they couldn't do it because Steve Walt and I both have tenure at elite universities, and we were protected. I think that anybody who doesn't have tenure and takes on Israel and U.S. policy towards Israel is going to suffer enormously. And the best example of this would be Norman Finkelstein, who was an untenured professor at DePaul and did not get tenure and is now permanently unemployed and living in Coney Island in Brooklyn. Stands virtually no chance of ever getting an academic job, despite the fact that he's published numerous books. He's done some first-class scholarly work and has had a huge impact on the discourse about Israel-Palestine issues. But his career is over in large part because the lobby went after him and was able to get him. Now, Steve and I were in a completely different position. So we have paid a certain price, but not a great price, and you know, we survived to fight another day.
I mean, you get phone calls, things of that nature from people?
Well, in this day and age, people don't call you on the phone, they send you emails.
Yeah.
And we got lots of emails, we got lots of letters, we got some phone calls. I would say that the overwhelming majority of emails and letters were supportive. I would argue that when we went around the country to talk about the book, after the book came out, Steve and I went all over the United States, and we went abroad as well, including Los Angeles. By the way, we went to Israel as well and talked about the book. But I think that the attitude of most people who came to our talks was that they were glad that we had come out to talk about the subject. My sense is that most Americans just wanted to talk about the subject. It wasn't that they wanted to come out and agree with us. Some did for sure, but not the vast majority. And some wanted to come out and disagree with us, which is fine. What we really wanted to do here was open up the discourse, just get a debate going, get the subject out in the open, let's talk about it. And if people disagreed with us, fine. We used to tell organizers that if somebody wanted to stand up and holler at us for a minute or two and tell us that they thought we were wrong or we were terrible people, that was perfectly fine. Like, this is America. That's what it's supposed to be all about. Let them come out and voice their opinion. It's fine. Let's just have a debate. Let's have a discourse about the whole subject of Israel and U.S. policy towards Israel and the lobby itself. And I think, by the way, we were quite successful in generating that debate.
Yeah, absolutely. What kind of reception did you get in Israel?
We had a wonderful reception in Israel. I would argue that it's much easier to talk about these things in Israel than it is in the United States.
Yeah, that's what Jeff Halpert said.
Yeah, Israel's a much more open society when it comes to talking about Israel than the United States. There are just a lot of American Jews, not the vast majority, but a lot of American Jews who just don't want to talk about Israel and don't want anybody criticizing Israel, and will go to great lengths to shut down those criticizers. So
what's their fear? What are they afraid of?
Well, I think if you had an honest and open discussion about Israeli policy, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, and the lobby, there would be a great deal more criticism of Israel, and the U.S.-Israeli relationship would be forced to change. The reason that the lobby exists and the reason that the lobby works overtime to shut down discourse is that it's pushing a policy that most Americans wouldn't accept if they understood it. That's what made Steve Walt and I so dangerous. We were telling the basic story for the first time to a wide audience. Previously, the story had been told by others, but it hadn't reached a large audience. But here you had two academics who had impeccable reputations, who were attached to two prestigious universities, and who had no history of criticizing Israel or the U.S.-Israeli relationship, writing a comprehensive article and then a comprehensive book laying out what was going on with regard to Israeli policy towards the Palestinians and the U.S.-Israeli relationship.
I want to ask you about the idea of a confederation, creating a third government common to the Israelis and the Palestinians together, so that the Israelis will have their own government, the Palestinians will have their own government, but there will be a third independent government for the people of Israel and Palestine together that will work with these two governments. What's your opinion on that?
I think it's just much simpler to have a two-state solution. Let the Israelis run their own politics and let the Palestinians run their politics.
But even if there is a two-state solution, you need somebody to coordinate and to facilitate peace. And wouldn't it make sense if they live together that they will have their own government together?
Well, I think if you're interested in facilitating peace, you have to do a number of other things. First of all, you have to make sure that both sides have hardly any incentive to go to war. This is why I believe it's very important to create a viable Palestinian state, a flourishing Palestinian state, so that the Palestinians understand that if they start a conflict with Israel, they'll lose a tremendous amount. And of course, you want to make sure that Israel flourishes as well. Furthermore, I think it's very important that you have a lot of attention paid to the Israeli-Palestinian situation by the United States. The United States has to be something of a night watchman to make sure that the Israelis are not doing anything to the Palestinians and the Palestinians are not threatening the Israelis. But I think a confederation is not going to solve the problem in any meaningful way because that body at the top is going to be comprised of Israelis and Palestinians. And I think they have a rich history of not being able to get along with each other. And therefore the best way to maintain peace between the two sides, to maintain stability, is to separate them, keep them both prosperous, and have the United States do everything it can to prevent them from fighting with each other.
But the United States failed to do that and failed to separate them and failed to watch both of them, really.
Oh, absolutely. But that's because of the lobby, right? And the reason that we're headed towards a one-state solution, right, and we're not going to have a confederation either, is because of the lobby. The lobby is going to make sure that Israel ends up as a greater Israel. The lobby is going to make sure we have a one-state solution, and in the end, they're going to make sure that that is an apartheid state, which is disastrous for Israel. Mm-hmm. It would make much more sense to have either a two-state solution or a confederation. I would have no problem living with a confederation if the Israelis and the Palestinians agreed to it. And one could argue that you could then bring the United States in to help facilitate peace with a confederation. That would be fine. Mm-hmm. But the real problem here, again, is the lobby. I mean, Israel itself is interested in creating a greater Israel, mm-hmm. and it doesn't care whether it's an apartheid state or not. So the problem starts with Israel. But the point that I would make is that Israel could not get away with that. The United States would not allow Israel to get away with that, mm-hmm. nor would the Europeans, nor would the so-called international community, were it not for the fact that the lobby protects Israel at almost every turn.
Why is the lobby so powerful? Is it because it has financial backing? Because it has, what makes it so powerful?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. First of all, it's just important to understand that given the structure of the American political system, interest groups wield enormous power here in the United States. I mean, we have the gun lobby, the National Rifle Association, we have the farm lobby, we have the Cuba lobby, and these are all enormously powerful interest groups. The United States has long had a completely discombobulated policy towards Cuba. Why is that the case? Because of the Cuba lobby. And so therefore it's hardly surprising that the Israel lobby has so much power. It just happens that interest groups in the United States, when they're well organized, well run, and well funded, which is true of the Israel lobby and a lot of these other lobbies as well, those lobbies wield great influence. I think to get into the particulars, I think, first of all, votes matter. If you remember the 2000 election, it turned on a few votes in Florida. There's a large Jewish community and a large Cuban American community in Florida. Therefore, anybody who's running for president of the United States wants to make sure that he doesn't alienate either Cubans or Jews for fear that it'll be another election like the 2000 election.
By the way, are they friends with each other, these two lobbies? Are they?
I know no evidence of that. I don't know of any evidence of the two of them sort of working together to push a particular policy. But you know, Jews are a small percentage of the population, probably under 2%. But again, you don't need to be large in number if you're located in states where there are lots of electoral votes and one anticipates a close election. So this is one advantage that Jews have and that the lobby capitalizes on. Another is money. There's no question that there are a large number of PACs that control quite a bit of money. And to get elected dog catcher in the United States, you need huge amounts of money.
Right.
And if you're running for president or senator or representative, you need gobs of money. And these PACs channel money towards people who are pro-Israel. And if somebody is anti-Israel, they'll channel that money towards that person's opponent. And most people figure out relatively quickly that it makes no sense to challenge the lobby because it's difficult enough to get elected and stay in office without having the Israel lobby put its gun sights on you. So I think money also matters. I think Israel also has lots of friends in the media. You know, newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post are decidedly pro-Israel. So all of these things add up. One final point, there is no Palestinian lobby. There's no Arab lobby. There's no other side. The Israel lobby basically is out there all by itself. And in that kind of situation, it's going to be very successful at getting its way. And it is very successful.
Yeah.
To the detriment of Israel, I might add.
Yeah. All right. I want to thank you so much. And I
You're
thought
welcome.
it was a very good interview. I enjoyed it.
Excellent.
Yeah. So.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Sure.